internet user, they don't know who, searched for Nancy Guthrie's address and daughter's salary before Today host's mother vanished. This is literally breaking after the discussion we just had. That's crazy. I don't know how you can tell this. Fox News is citing Google Trends. An internet user appears to have searched for Nancy Guthrie's home address in the weeks prior to her suspected.
The moment those words left her mouth, the entire narrative shifted from a tragic disappearance to something far darker, far more calculated, and far more terrifying than anyone wanted to admit. Because this was no longer just about a missing woman, this was about a digital trail, a hidden obsession, and a stranger who may have been silently circling Nancy Guthrie's life for months before she vanished. And when Megyn Kelly leaned forward and began reading what had just broken, the atmosphere changed from speculation to exposure, from mystery to what felt like a blueprint of premeditation unfolding in real time. That was the moment everything cracked open, because this was no random curiosity search buried in the endless noise of the internet. This was someone deliberately typing in Nancy Guthrie's home address before she disappeared. Someone intentionally seeking out the exact location where she slept, where she felt safe, where she believed she was protected, and that search alone would have been chilling enough. But it did not stop there. It did not fade into obscurity. It multiplied. It resurfaced. It repeated itself in a pattern that experts call reconnaissance, and what the rest of us call stalking dressed up in digital anonymity. Megyn Kelly did not treat it as background noise. She treated it as what it was beginning to look like, the first thread in a larger fabric of obsession. Because once the home address is searched, once maps and images are pulled up, once curiosity becomes repetition, the narrative stops being accidental and starts becoming intentional. And intention is where fear lives. This is where the story turned from unsettling to methodical, because now we are not talking about one late-night search. We are talking about a timeline stretching across months. June in Arizona, then January again, and January 11th of all dates, a date law enforcement specifically flagged for. Neighbors to check their Ring cameras, which means the digital footprint was not just theoretical. It overlapped with physical surveillance concerns, and when those two worlds collide, the online obsession begins to look like real-world preparation. The idea that someone in the Catalina foothills searched for Nancy's address in June 2025 and then returned months later to look again suggests not impulse but revisitation, not chance but planning, because predators do not strike without studying the terrain, they do not move without mapping exits, and they do not choose without calculating risk, and suddenly the Google search bar begins to resemble a scouting tool rather than a curiosity portal. And then came the layer that made the narrative even more combustible. The salary search. Because when Savannah Guthrie's income enters the picture, the motive whispers greed, ransom, targeting, wealth profiling, and even though public figures often have their salaries speculated about online.
Fox News Digital has learned that mysterious Google searches for Nancy's address and Savannah's salary occurred before her disappearance. Google Trends records show there was one search for Guthrie's address in the Catalina foothills between June 21st and June 28th, 2025 by someone in Arizona. They can tell you exactly where the search came from. The address was searched again once on January 11th, 2026. That's one of the dates that the sheriff's office is asking people to check their Ring cameras for. This is getting creepy. The January 11th date also surfaced in a message on the Ring camera app. Yeah, he's.
The timing here wrapped itself around the address searches like a shadow, suggesting that whoever was digging into Nancy's location might also have been assessing the financial value of the family connected to her, which is where the story transforms into something that feels less random and more targeted. Images and maps, not just text entries, but visuals, angles, layouts, perspective, a map of the home. And that detail changes everything, because now the obsession is not abstract, it is spatial, it is architectural. It is someone wanting to see the driveway, the entry points, the surrounding terrain, the way the house sits in relation to the street. And image searches are not about trivia, they are about visualization. about mentally rehearsing movement, about picturing a path before taking it. The sequence alone is chilling. March searches, November searches, December salary inquiry, January address revisit, and within weeks Nancy is gone. And when Megyn Kelly walked through that timeline, it did not feel like coincidence. It felt like escalation, a gradual tightening of focus, as if someone was building up to something and using the internet as their silent accomplice. Experts began speaking about pre-offense behavior, about the psychology of individuals who study their targets long before they act, about obsessive internet usage that mirrors fixation. And once that framework is introduced, the Google searches are no longer passive data points. They become evidence of mental rehearsal, pre-offense behavior, obsessive internet interest.
There were also 2 separate Google image searches for Nancy's address in Arizona. One, again, sometime between March 1st and 8th, 2025. Google image searches, guys. Google image searches, in addition to just typing in the Google search bar. Okay, also 2 separate Google image searches for Nancy's address in Arizona. One was sometime between March 1st and 8th, 2025. The other was between November 30th and December 1st, 2025, specifically looking for images or a map of the home. In addition to the address, in the days leading up to Nancy's disappearance, quote, Savannah Guthrie's salary was searched from Tucson sometime between December 13th and 20th.
Materials, backpacks, ropes. This is the language of preparation, not randomness. And when you overlay that psychological profile onto the timeline of repeated address and image searches, the picture that forms is not flattering. It is predatory, because predators do not simply appear. They study, they revisit, they calculate, and they test their plans in their minds before stepping into the real world. Then came the structured breakdown of the timeline itself. The dates lined up like stepping stones toward the disappearance. Each search acting like a rehearsal, each revisit narrowing the gap between curiosity and action. When you hear it laid out like that, when you feel the repetition echo across months, it stops being random noise and starts sounding like a drumbeat, steady and deliberate, growing louder as the date of the disappearance approaches. And this is the exposure that detonated the conversation. Because Megyn Kelly did not present it as speculation, she presented it as a sequence. And sequences are powerful because they imply progression, they imply build up, they imply intent. The real bombshell is not just that someone searched Nancy Guthrie's home address, it is that they kept coming back, revisiting, re-examining, reimagining, as if perfecting something in their mind, and that digital obsession, now exposed to the public, suggests that the unknown predator may have been hiding in plain sight behind a keyboard long before anyone realized Nancy was in danger. The exposure did not end with the timeline, because once Megyn Kelly pulled that thread into the light, the deeper implication began spreading like wildfire through every corner of the conversation, forcing people to confront the terrifying possibility that Nancy Guthrie had not been randomly selected in a moment of opportunity, but had instead been quietly chosen, studied, and psychologically targeted long before she ever realized someone was watching. Because the internet does not forget, and it does not hide patterns, it preserves them, freezes them in time, and when those patterns reveal repeated visits to a specific home address, repeated image searches of the same physical structure, and repeated attempts to understand the financial status of the family connected to that address, it stops looking like curiosity and starts looking like fixation evolving into action. What made this revelation even more disturbing was the cold precision of the repetition itself, because whoever was behind those searches did not just look once and disappear. They returned again and again, almost as if they were refining their understanding, correcting blind spots, updating their mental map. And this pattern is exactly what investigators and profilers warn about when analyzing individuals who operate in secrecy. Because obsession rarely manifests as a single moment, it manifests as a pattern of escalating attention that gradually narrows its focus until the target becomes the center of someone else's world. Megyn Kelly's exposure forced people to imagine the invisible timeline behind Nancy's ordinary days, the unseen presence of someone who may have already known where she lived, how her home was positioned, and what kind of family she was connected to, and that thought alone shattered the illusion of safety that most people cling to, because it proved that someone could be studying your life silently, anonymously, without ever stepping into your line of sight, hiding behind screens, hiding behind digital anonymity, hiding behind the illusion that no one would ever connect the dots. The revelation of the image searches was particularly haunting because image searches are not passive. They are intentional visual examinations. They allow someone to virtually stand outside a house without ever being physically present, to study entrances, to analyze surroundings, to mentally rehearse movements. And when those searches happen repeatedly across different months, it suggests that the individual behind them was not satisfied with a single glance, but needed to return, needed to verify, needed to confirm, as if the house itself had become an object of fixation. And then came the deeper psychological layer that made the entire situation even more explosive. The understanding that this kind of digital behavior aligns almost perfectly with documented patterns of premeditated targeting, where individuals research their targets extensively before taking action, building familiarity with the environment in order to eliminate uncertainty. And uncertainty is the enemy of control, and control is often the driving force behind predatory behavior, because control transforms unpredictability into calculated movement, and calculated movement transforms possibility into reality. The moment Megyn Kelly laid out those search dates in sequence, it forced everyone listening to confront a possibility that had previously been too disturbing to articulate, that Nancy Guthrie may have been living her daily life unaware that someone had already constructed a mental blueprint of her world, unaware that someone may have already visualized her home, her surroundings, her vulnerability. And that kind of invisible observation changes everything, because it turns the disappearance from an isolated event into the culmination of a hidden process. What makes digital evidence so devastating is that it cannot lie about its timing. It records intent through repetition, and repetition reveals priority, and priority reveals focus, and focus reveals obsession. And obsession is rarely harmless when it is directed at a specific individual and reinforced over months of silent surveillance. Because obsession does not fade naturally, it intensifies, it deepens, it grows stronger with each revisit, and that is exactly what the search timelines suggested, an intensification of attention that escalated as time passed. The fact that the searches occurred in Arizona added another chilling dimension, because it meant that the individual behind them could have been physically distant while mentally present, observing from afar, gathering information without ever exposing themselves. And distance creates a dangerous illusion of safety, because it allows someone to operate without being seen, without being recognized, without triggering suspicion. And when distance is combined with digital anonymity, it becomes almost impossible for the target to detect the threat until it is too late. Megyn Kelly's exposure did not just reveal a disturbing set of Google searches, it revealed the invisible vulnerability that exists in the modern world, where personal information can be accessed, analyzed, and weaponized by individuals whose identities remain hidden. And once that information is gathered, once the target is understood, the line between observation and action becomes dangerously thin. The repetition of the searches leading up to Nancy's disappearance created a sense of inevitability, as if each revisit was bringing the unknown individual closer to a decision point, closer to the moment when observation would no longer be enough, because observation feeds imagination, and imagination feeds intention, and intention feeds action. And once action begins, the consequences ripple outward in ways that cannot be reversed. What made the entire situation even more explosive was the realization that the digital trail itself could become the key to identifying the individual behind the obsession. Because every search, every click, every revisit leaves behind traces. And those traces can be analyzed, reconstructed, and connected, forming a map that leads back to the source. And that possibility created both fear and hope. Fear that someone had been hiding in plain sight, and hope that the same digital obsession that enabled them to study Nancy could ultimately expose them. Megyn Kelly's revelation transformed the narrative from a disappearance into an exposure of hidden behavior, hidden obsession, and hidden intent. And once the public became aware of those searches, the conversation shifted from asking what happened to Nancy Guthrie to asking who had been watching her long before she vanished, because the searches themselves were no longer abstract data. They were evidence of attention, evidence of fixation, evidence that someone had invested time and energy into understanding her life. The most disturbing part of all was the silence surrounding the individual behind those searches. Because while Nancy's disappearance became public, the person who had been studying her remained invisible, protected by anonymity, protected by distance. protected by the illusion that they had left. No trace, and yet the very tool they used to observe her had quietly recorded their presence, preserving it in a digital archive that would never forget. This exposure did not just reveal a potential suspect, it revealed the terrifying reality that obsession can exist unseen, that someone can be watching without being noticed, that someone can be studying without being detected, and that by the time the pattern becomes visible, the damage may already be done. And that realization is what made Megyn Kelly's exposure so explosive, because it forced everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth that the unknown perder may have been closer than anyone realized, hiding not in shadows, but behind a screen, patiently waiting, silently watching, and leaving behind a trail that would eventually expose the obsession that had been there all along.